Cole has his pet bird.
I don't have a pet bird. It's creepy.
I have the content check and then my test scratch.
Perfect. I will take it. I know I have stuff to hand back to you, but I'll get it. Yep. All right. Let's start class today. I don't really have a lot of announcements other than hopefully you're studying for that final. It's a week from today, 3:30 in Bell 2220, which I believe is Wallenberg. How many announcements? So we'll jump right on into it. So Tuesday, we talked a lot about how we might tell different species apart, right, and what mechanisms we might use to tell them apart. And we learned there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages for using just how they look, or just their DNA, or just how they use their environment. Today we're going to focus on what's called the biological species concept. And this is the most commonly used concept to determine if they are different species or not. And this concept relies upon reproductive isolation, right? Meaning that if it's a singular species, this concept would state that within the species, they have the potential to interbreed with one another, right? They can produce offspring, and that offspring is viable, right? So that offspring can go on to produce more offspring. And if it's considered a different species, they should not be able to interbreed, right? So it's really going off of the reproductive isolation mechanism that we talked about on Tuesday. All right, so less how they look or less genetic, more how they reproduce. And I would say biological species concept is the most common concept used, but it's not the only concept that's out there. Again, like we talked about, it's really species dependent, right? For one organism, you might use the biological species concept. For another, maybe you'll want to rely more on molecular methods. All right, so biological species concept, right, relies on reproductive isolating mechanisms. We kind of briefly talked about this on Tuesday. There's much more to it that we're going to go over. All right, so as a reminder, reproductive isolating mechanisms are mechanisms that prevent species or prevent individuals of different species from reproducing with one another. All right, so on Tuesday I gave the example, I believe I had an image with two foxes, right, and there was a big river separating them, right, so they were prevented from mating by this geological barrier. And again, I have another similar image up here with these deer. They have been prevented from mating with one another because there's a physical river separating them that they theoretically cannot cross. Right? So this is one of the most major way that new species will arise. Right? Mutations can lead to new species. Right? How they use their environment can lead to new species. But more often than not, it's being reproductively isolated from other members of a population that will lead to a new species arise over time. All right, and typically, if we're talking about a new species arising, right, it's going to have some sort of a genetic component to that speciation, right? Typically, there's going to be some genes that are changed. All right, so reproductive isolation. There's a lot more to it. So we're going to break down reproductive isolation into many different subcategories here, but we could broadly break it down into two categories at first. All right, we could break it down into what's called pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms or post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. All right, so if we're thinking about species that reproduce sexually, right? So they're going to go through meiosis. Gametes are going to be produced, right? Gametes from two individuals, right, that are haploid at the end of meiosis will unite, right? Fertilization will occur, and we will create a diploid cell that is now called a zygote, right? So these pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms is going to prevent those gametes from ever meeting and prevent fertilization from occurring. Whereas the post-zygotic mechanisms is going to prevent that zygote that could be produced from being viable. right? Maybe that offspring is never going to be born. Maybe if it is born, the offspring is sterile. Right? So we have on this image here, we have our two gametes. They're red and yellow in this image. Right? There's a bunch of different ways that they could be isolated pre-zygotically, right? So they physically never have the chance to meet, right? They could meet and fertilization could occur, but there's going to be another series of obstacles standing in their way that might not be the consequence of having an offspring or an offspring that's viable, right? It's only when two gametes meet, fertilization is successful, offspring is produced, and that offspring can produce more offspring, and thus further the population, right? That is when reproductive isolating mechanisms are not at play. That's the only instance. Otherwise, there's all these different pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers, and we're going to talk about each. So we're going to start with the pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Right, so these isolating mechanisms that prevent these gametes from ever interacting with each other. Right, there is no chance that fertilization could occur. Right, we've talked about one of these mechanisms. This is really the only mechanism I've talked about so far. But that would be habitat isolation. Right, having that geological barrier that prevents contact. Right, so we talked about the foxes. I had that image on the last slide with the deer, that river separating them. Maybe if we're thinking smaller species like these snails, right, maybe the population diverged to avoid a crack or a big chasm, right, and now they cannot cross that chasm to meet up again, thus leading to two new species. Right, something about their environment has physically separated the population into two and prevented them from being able to breed with one another once again. Right? So habitat isolation, we've talked about this one, this should be more or less familiar. Temporal isolation is a new one. All right, so temporal isolation is where they are in the same area. They have the ability to interact with each other, but they are a different species because they reproduce at different times. All right, so here I have two different crickets. Right? They look the same. They can live in the same area, but the spring-field cricket only reproduces in the spring, and the fall-field cricket only reproduces in the fall. Right? Therefore, a fall-field cricket cannot reproduce with a spring-field cricket because their mating seasons are completely opposite. Right? So they've been reproductively isolated due to time in which they actually go through their breeding season. All right, so habitat isolation, we have temporal isolation. We also have behavioral isolation. All right, so I like this image from the amoeba sisters here. So behaviors are important in mate choice. So here we have two birds. One is singing a country music song, the other hates country music, right? Because that one hates country music, they are going to choose not to mate with that bird that loves country music because of the way it behaves, because it sings country music, right? So its behaviors are dictating whether or not these individuals will mate. Right, so this could be applied to real life bird song, right? Maybe the specific tune or the note that a bird is singing is unattractive to the other bird, right? And thus they will never mate together. We can have mechanical isolation. So this is where they have the ability to mate, but physically they cannot, right? Their genitalia are incompatible. There is no way to make it work, right? So here we have a very large frog and a very small frog, all right? They are going to have mechanical isolation. There's no way that they can successfully mate together, right? So think of it like if you had a puzzle piece, right? And the puzzle pieces don't fit together. All right, so this is more important for animals that tend to have random mating. So they release sperm or egg into the air. The gametes I'm getting ahead of myself here. This I think would be more common in species that look like they should be the same species but are different, right? So these frog species, one is big, one is small. It's probably that size difference, that mechanical isolation, that inability to breed that led them being separate species, right? Even though they're both frogs. Gametic isolation is where they could mate, right? Mating can occur, but the gametes are not going to unite. All right, so maybe these two species of frogs, they mated with one another, but the sperm is never going to mate or fertilize the egg, right? And thus, a zygote can never be produced, right? So gametic isolation, right? This is where it's more important in organisms that just release their egg and sperm, say, into water or into the air, and hope it connects with another of the same species. Right, so if we have a lot of pollen going through the air, right, we would hope that the pine tree species would unite with the pine tree species, other pollen in the air to make a new individual, right? Instead of maybe like a pine tree pollen landing on an oak tree, right? Pine tree on an oak tree would be an example of gametic isolation. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to work. All right, so all of these mechanisms prevent a zygote from being formed, prevent fertilization from happening. But there are instances where fertilization can occur, right? So now a zygote can be produced. Right, now this is a lot less common in nature, right? Because you don't want to put in all that time and that effort into finding a mate, into raising an offspring, for that offspring to either not be born alive, right, or be non-viable, right? Maybe it's not fertile itself and can't pass down your genes, right? So hybrid inviability is one way that this could occur, right? So we have successful fertilization of our gametes, a zygote is created. That zygote might go through mitosis a little bit, right? An embryo might start being formed, right? But it's not going to live to full term, right? Either it's not going to be birthed or it's not going to result in an egg that is fertile, right? Hybrid sterility, right? Now fertilization has occurred, right? Those gametes have united, a zygote has formed, and an offspring can be produced. But that offspring is sterile. Right? That offspring cannot produce more offspring. Right? So the classic example here is the donkey and the horse. Right? They can mate, they can produce offspring. That offspring is a mule, right? But mules are sterile. Right? Mules cannot produce offspring. Our last instance here is hybrid breakdown. So that's where the gametes can unite. Right? Fertilization occurs, a zygote happens, an individual is born. That individual is sterile, but because these species that produced each of these gametes were likely different species, right? Even if it's viable and fertile, they're going to have a lot of genetic abnormalities, right? So down the line, after a few generations, this population would likely die out because it wouldn't be able to sustain itself. Right? There'd be too many genetic abnormalities for this population to be healthy. All right, so we have pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Gametes never meet. Post-zygotic isolating mechanism. Gametes meet, but the offspring is just not viable for whatever means. Right? And this is really, again, that basis for that biological species concept. Right? Again, stating reproductive isolation has to occur in order for a species to be considered a different species. Now, like all the concepts we talked about on Tuesday, biological species concept has its pros, has its cons. Right? The disadvantage is that we can't look at this for fossils, right? Because we don't know how they behaved, how they interacted. And we can't look at this for species that reproduce asexually. Right? If a species reproduces asexually, it's not going through meiosis, and it's not even going to create gametes. And it really can only be applied to populations that overlap geographically. Right? So think about if you have two bird species, right? Maybe you can find both bird species on campus here, right? But maybe it's behavioral isolation. They don't like the way each other sings. That prevents them from mating. Right? One of the species that we know of where this biological species concept starts to break down is the growler bear. Has anyone heard of the growler bear? All right, it is a hybrid between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. There's actually a link in the notes section of this slide if you want to watch a video on it. But essentially, grizzly bears, polar bears, they are different species. We know this. They look different. They have different behaviors. They use their environment differently. They have separate diets, right? We know they're separate species. But there are instances where the northernmost range of the grizzly bear and the southernmost range of the polar bear overlap, right? They mate, they produce offspring, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that offspring, right? We produce a growler bear, right? We produce this hybrid. So we know they're separate species, right? And we know that theoretically they should be reproductively isolated if we were to follow the biological species concept, but this just isn't the case. So again, this is an issue where we have to figure out what is most appropriate for the organism or the species that we are looking at. All right, I have an example up here on the screen, and I want you to answer the 3 questions I have regarding this example.
You.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I just not paying attention to that. I just heard the last part of that sentence. I know a guy who almost worked
Horrible guy. I feel like you don't get a lot of slander guys in that profession.
He didn't go to anybody else. To be fair, a hell of a lot of money. He didn't less. What's that? Yeah, you see how they do it.
I don't want to see this.
Why don't we change topics? Yeah, are we getting calculators on this? No, but like, I don't. Because she gave us something to write. An 8-minute presentation.
I can find 70 of them.
Which I don't know. No, that's actually fine. We can make slides for it and it's offered me a paper.
If I can't, it's just going to be like
And
the
then
equation.
we finished the presentation on Monday and she wants she wants 1,000 each paper.
Do it
Or
in
1,000
your
word
head.
paper. No, I thought you were going to do
I feel like that would be unfair.
the 3 that we're choosing.
Some of you are going to be
Really easy grader.
get the points, and some of you won't, just based on your innate ability.
Yeah, that's like data, release a day.
Yeah. Oh, today?
Oh,
So excited.
We'll probably get through most of the content. If we don't get through the content check, you can send that to me. I'll let you. All right, so this is a real example, all right? There are species of dragonfly that have a very specialized genitalial structure that prevents them from mating with the female dragonflies of a separate species. Again, you don't want to go through all the effort of mating with a species where your offspring is not going to be viable. So this is the result of speciation that depended on what type of reproductive isolation? Mechanical. Yeah, this is mechanical isolation. All right, so this is an example of mechanical isolation. Is this pre or post zygotic isolation? Yes, pre-zygotic isolation. And does this mean that the two species will not or cannot mate with one another?
Cannot.
They cannot. They physically cannot mate. All right. Let's see. Any questions so far? All right. So we're talking about these mechanisms that could lead to new species. So let's talk about mechanisms of leading to new species. All right. Mechanisms of speciation. Like, how could this occur more broadly? Maybe reproductive isolation is in play at this place or at this point. So if we're talking about a new species arising, right? Typically, it's going to be caused by genetic changes, right? And it's typically small genetic changes over time that will accumulate. And there's really two possible reasons or two explanations as to why we think speciation can arise. Right? We think that speciation can arise due to abrupt events that cause reproductive isolation. Right? So physically separating them. Right? Maybe that's a catastrophic flood. Maybe it's a wildfire. Or maybe it's speciation where there is nothing physically preventing them or separating them, right? But maybe they're using the environment different, and that's what leads to separation. Right, so there's these two broad categories. Either something causes separation within the population, or they're just using their environment differently. All right, now one of the terms that we're going to talk about quite a bit here, right, is this term called niche or niche. Right, both is correct. I've heard it both ways. I am in the niche category. I like to say niche over niche. All right, well, you've probably heard it both ways. So a niche is simply referring to the role that an organism plays in its community and how it interacts with everything around it. Right. So both physical, environmental conditions, and other organisms. Right? So if we were to talk about the niche of a campus squirrel, right? I would say the niche of the squirrel would be, well, all of campus, right? Probably interacting with humans quite a bit, interacting with other organisms. The niche might be food left out that it's grabbing. Right? It might be other predators in the area. It's the trees that it climbs. Right? It's the bushes that it hides behind. Any way that it's interacting. All right. So if we look at these two theories of speciation, the first one actually doesn't really use the term niche at all. We'll get to that one. Right? But this first one has to deal with speciation because there is a physical barrier. Right? Now this might be abrupt, like a flash flood or a wildfire, a volcanic eruption, or it could take some time to develop, right? Like the formation of a mountain range or a glacier. Something has to physically divide this population in order for this type of speciation to occur. Right? So habitat isolation. Right, that's part of one of the reproductive isolating mechanisms. That would be a good example of allopatric speciation. Right? Here we have a cartoon example of these squirrels. Right? They're separated by this river. Right? They're starting to develop different habitats or different habits within their habitats. And then over time, they're completely new species. They're completely separate species because of that initial separation. Same with these porkfish here, right? The Caribbean Sea, right? You used to be able to pass from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean, right? But then this isthmus of Panama arose, so this physical separation, this landmass arose that divided that water into two, right? Separated the Caribbean Sea from the Pacific Ocean. So this porkfish developed into two separate species of porkfish, depending on what side of that isthmus that they were currently living on. Right? So there's a lot of really good examples out there of allopatric speciation. But it could be that maybe there's no geological barrier. Right? If there's no geological barrier, you would call this sympatric speciation. Right? So this occurs when members of the same species, they live in the same area, and they're divided into two separate categories based on a variety of ways. Right? It could be genetic, like polyploidy, or it could be how they use their environment. So I have an example up here of carp, right? And if we look at this example, we're showing different chromosomes, right? We see that we're starting with these diploid organisms, right? They're creating this hybrid. This hybrid is going to mate with another individual that happens to be tetraploid. And now we have this new tetraploid individual. This tetraploid individual is now no longer going to be able to mate with the original parent population. Right? So basically it's a change in polyploidy. We've gone from diploid to tetraploid, and that change in polyploidy has led to a different species of rice. Right? They're still living in the same lake or the same pond. Right? They can interact with each other. They just are physically separated and cannot mate, cannot produce offspring. All right, so that would be an example of like a genetic cause. We can also have adaptation to local environments, right, which is this next slide is a real life example of how this is currently happening in these North American apple maggot fly populations. Right? So they're not new species yet, but this mechanism of sympatric speciation is at play. Right? They will eventually become different species. But we have this maggot fly. Right? Now, originally it fed on hawthorn trees. Right? It ate the fruit of the hawthorn trees. But about 200 years ago, apple trees were introduced. Right? And they found that they also like to eat the apples. Right? So now they had both apple trees and hawthorn trees to eat. Right? Those that ate the apples, right, tended to get food faster because apples mature faster. Right? Because they matured faster, because they had a faster food source, they started to reproduce faster, these flies. Based on those, or that's different than those eating the hawthorn fruit. Right? The hawthorn fruit took a little bit longer to ripen. Right? So these fruit flies that depended on the hawthorn fruit, right, had their reproductive cycles a little bit later. So we're starting to see a temporal separation, right, based on the foods that they're eating and when those foods ripen. Right? So over time, right, we currently consider them different subspecies, but over time, given a few more generations, right, a couple more decades here, they will likely become very distinct species because of how they use their environment, even though they live in the same area. All right, I've done a lot of talking, so I wanted to step back and just give us a quick example problem here. So I want you to tell me what is allopatric and sympatric speciation?
Preference. Yeah.
Obviously, you see
Like a jackrabbit.
person likes there just in
Yeah. That's where my went.
you know, well, like the one that she just gave was like the flies.
Where you are.
Yeah, I only turn in
Environmental, like the apple trees were there, so some of the flies came out.
I was just gonna ask.
And they got food faster, so as a result of one eating other species, one species is gonna be in the fall.
The detail on the web is just showing up.
Some are gonna wait till fall.
I'm trying
Right.
to do it
They're
as
gonna separate.
detailed as I can, but I don't really know.
Like I was looking at this example and it's
Alpaca
Yeah.
is just
well,
geox.
see that. I'm a little worried. That's why I turned some in first. Did you get price for it?
There's 31.
Hopefully that means it's fine. I feel like you would have gotten the back there with Yeah. Right.
Because I don't want to do all the rest of them.
Wrong. I guess I could send him an email. Harassment that.
He loves me.
So frank. So much for letters.
Continue on, right?
Yeah.
And I have that, at least.
Great.
But they're like, okay, just to put me at ease, I need to get on the final.
You asked him.
I did. There's no
I
like,
bet you wouldn't like that.
50 out of 120.
Well, odds are in your favor.
I made it out to be a very
Especially when you get those.
All
3
right,
points.
looking at this picture here, which one, the one with or without the mountain range, is an example of sympatric speciation? Without, yeah. So this would be an example of sympatric speciation. Think sympatric, same environment, right? And then that mountain range, right, you only have 2 options, so it has to be the allopatric speciation one. Any questions about these mechanisms of speciation? All right. So we've talked about how we can get different species. Now let's talk about a group of species. So we're going to shift our focus to populations now and talk about population ecology. So population ecology, or let me back up. Ecology in general refers to how organisms interact with other organisms and their environment. Right? That's what we're studying when we say we're studying ecology. Right? So we're talking about any biotic factors as well as any abiotic factors. Right? So individuals within the same population, I know we've defined population a couple of times here, right? Living in the same geographic area, have the ability to interact with one another, but they're going to be influenced by the same conditions, right? They're going to rely on the same resource, or the same resources, I should say, so same food, same habitat. They're going to be influenced by the same environmental factors, right? So if it's a dreary, rainy day, it's probably going to be a dreary, rainy day for the entire population, right? As long as that population isn't huge. And they're going to be able to interact and breed with one another. There's no reproductive isolation. All right, so population ecology. We're looking how a population of a species interacts with other organisms, interacts with their environment, but also interacts between themselves. Right? So population ecologists will often look at the density of organisms. So how many organisms are there in an area, right, for that population. They might also look at demography, things like birth rates, death rates, migration, immigration, size, age ranges, the age in which they most likely will die, the age in which they most likely reach reproductive maturity, right? They're going to take all of these types of measures, right? And we're actually not going to talk about most of them because I had to cut out some content. A lot of population ecology is math, so I cut out the math. I tried to make it easier for you here, right? So a lot of times population ecologists will work with some mathematical models to try to figure out how a population might change, right? And so why population ecology is so important, it helps us decide about managing species, right? Think about endangered species or species that we don't want to go extinct. How might we conserve these species, right? It's helpful to know how long do they live, what size populations do they prefer to live in, what's the average age of a death or a birth, right? It's really helpful to know all this information if we want to protect a species. All right, so population ecology. We're taking all these measurements about a population, but how do we do it? Well, if we're looking at organisms, we're talking about population size, we're often just have to take a manual count, right? So a lot of times it's trapping animals, or it's taking a sample of the plant community. So a lot of times if we're talking about plants, right, plant scientists will take what's called a quadrant out into the field. It's typically like a meter by meter box. Right? Place it down on the ground, and they might count all the individuals they are interested in within that 1 meter square. Right? Now they use this quadrant because if they're looking at a huge area, it's going to be impossible to count all those plants. Right? So rather they're doing a sampling of a few different spots in order to infer what this population looks like. Right? Now plants, they don't move, right? We can go out, put down a plot, and count what's in there. They're not going to move out of that plot while we're taking our measurements. But animals, insects, other organisms, they do move, right? So we have to have a way to capture them. And there's so many different methods for studying different species, right? You could use things like pitfall traps, right? You're literally digging a hole and hoping that something falls into it, and then you'll come back later and check to see what actually fell in that hole. It could be things like mist nets, right? So if you're studying birds, you might put this really fine net up across maybe 2 different trees. Birds will fly into that net and get caught, right? Get caught up and kind of tangled in that net. Now it doesn't hurt the birds, right? The researchers will come back, they'll untangle the birds, they likely band them with some sort of an ID around their legs, and then they release them again. Or maybe like a live mammal trap, right? Maybe we want to trap a raccoon or trap bears or any sort of other live mammal, right? We're going to trap it, take the measurements we need, maybe determine its age, see if it has any offspring nearby, right? Maybe we'll take its height, maybe we'll look at tail length, whatever metrics we need to take, and then we'll release it, right? I've done population ecology where I've looked at spiders, and you basically take a white sheet, you put it under a tree, and you shake the tree, and spiders fall into that white sheet, and then you count the spiders. So there's so many different methods. All right, so we have to track these animals so we can learn about the population, right? So we can see how populations might change in their size, how they might change in the space that they occupy, and how they might change over time. Right, again, there's a lot of formulas that we could apply here. Right? There's formulas where we could calculate what this population might look like 10 years into the future, or 50 years into the future. Right? What might the birth rates look like in 5 years? Right? Based on all the information we have now. A lot of times population ecology, kind of the big things, the big focus of population ecology is going to be how a population increases or decreases in size. Right? So generally they're going to increase through birth, right? So new individuals being born, or immigration, right? So individuals immigrating into the population from outside the population. And they're going to die or decrease because of deaths, right? Or they're going to emigrate out of the population. Right? So a lot of times that is the focus of this population ecology. All right, so we really want to see how it's going to change over time. What can we predict this population is going to look like in 10 years and 20 years? How can we best protect a population based on what we know? All right, so not only is it how a population dynamics works, so density and demography, but population ecologists would also want to look at their habitat, because habitat can affect population size. Some habitats are better than others, right? So maybe they have a better habitat quality, right? So a better habitat quality typically has a variety of species and different stages of life, right? So different species of trees, so therefore different trees that birds could nest in or bugs could live in, and then the birds could eat those bugs. Maybe there's some dead trees, grasses growing along the bottom. Right? There's a diverse there's a diversity of plant life here. Versus, right, a population of the same tree at the same stage of their life. Right? Maybe they're all 10 years old. Habitat quantity can be important, right? So a lot of times different populations can live in little patches of areas. Right? So if we think about, I'm going to use birds as an example because I think birds is a good example here too. Maybe birds only like to nest in oak trees. Right? Well, maybe I have a patch of oak trees like right outside of Nobel, another patch in the Arboretum, another patch over by Prairie View, right? I have scattered patches of habitat. So how many of those patches I have can influence the population size of those birds on campus. How big those patches are, right? So the degree of fragmentation can influence the size of a population. So fragmentation is where we take what was once a large, vast, uninterrupted habitat and we split it up, right? We fragment it into separate areas. And a lot of times when we do that, we're losing out on some species that need the big uninterrupted space in order to survive. So in this image here, we've fragmented this forest, and now these bears can no longer live in these smaller habitats. Right? Fragmentation is very common, right? And the most common cause of fragmentation is humans, right? Say we're developing a forest area, right? We need to put a road in. So we're going to split the forest in half by developing a road. And now we're going to build up some houses. So we're going to split it more ways by building roads out to houses, right? Now maybe we're starting a community, we need a town center, so we're splitting up more of the land, right? So that the size of these habitats just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Minnesota is a good example. Minnesota used to have a lot of native prairies, and now there's 0.2% of those native prairies left in Minnesota, and they're all in really small, fragmented patches. Mostly due to farming and settlement of humans in the area. How animals use that environment, too, can make a difference. Right? So we can look at dispersal patterns. Plants tend to have a really random dispersal pattern. Wherever the seed falls on the soil, that's where it's going to grow. Right? It really doesn't have much say in where the seed is going to fall. We could have clumped patterns like herds, right? So herds of elephants tend to stay clumped together. Or we can have very uniform patterns like we see in these penguins, right? They might be very dense in an area, but they're all relatively evenly spaced out from one another. All right. So we're looking at density, we're looking at demography, we're looking at habitat, and we want to know how a population grows. Most of the time we can split growth into two different models. Either there is exponential growth or logistic growth. Exponential growth means there's nothing limiting this population, right? This population has unlimited resources. This population can just keep on continue growing. There is no end to that growth in sight. Right, so in my case, I have on the board here a wolf population. There are ample prey in the area. There's a lot of rabbits, right? It's not going to go hungry anytime soon. The resources are unlimited. But maybe the resources become limited, all right? Or maybe it's a different environment, different area of the country where there's fewer resources. Now this wolf might show logistic growth, where the population of wolves can increase, but it's going to reach a plateau at some point where it stops increasing, right? It reaches a point where the resources are limiting. So let's look at examples. All right, exponential growth examples are actually quite fascinating because exponential growth is really not common, right? Most populations are going to have something that limits it. But exponential growth could apply to populations of introduced animals, right? So in Yellowstone National Park, right, that was the native range of these wolves, but they died out. Wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. And once they were reintroduced, right, they had abundant resources. There have been no packs of wolves there for quite a while. They had so many resources that population just skyrocketed. Now this graph ends at around 2011, so I don't know what the population looks like now. It's been a while. So maybe the exponential growth has stopped and it's starting to plateau out, or maybe it's still going, right? That'd be interesting to look up. Exotic species or non-native species, invasive species, right? They can often show exponential growth. So the Burmese pythons in Florida, right? They were likely a pet at one point, got released into the wild. They have no natural predators in Florida. They have ample resources, plenty to eat, plenty of space, right? Their population skyrocketed, right? There's now a ton of these pythons in Florida to the point where you can get paid to go out and kill these pythons because they're really a nuisance on the environment. They're not supposed to be there. They are invasive. They're wreaking havoc on the wildlife that is native to the area. But again, no end in sight to this population growth. Humans are another example, right? The human population worldwide over time has skyrocketed, particularly once we had advances in like healthcare and living conditions, right? There is no end in sight to our human population, right? At some point, we might predict our population would plateau out because we're going to run out of resources, right? But it hasn't happened yet. We're still showing exponential growth. More often than not, though, populations are going to show logistic growth, right? There's going to be something in the environment that limits it, right? That could be food. It could be nutrients. So plants need nutrients to grow. And if nutrients are limiting, that's a limiting resource. It might be places where an animal can retreat for safety, right? Or places where birds can nest. There's only so many tree snags that can make a good nest for a bird before they run out of space. Something in this environment is limited. So when a population grows, it's eventually going to reach this point where it's going to plateau out in its growth. It's going to reach a point where it has reached the carrying capacity, which really is just the maximum population size that can be supported by that environment. Right? So it gets to the point where you just cannot support any more individuals. And this can change even year to year. Right? So maybe one year, that carrying capacity is really high. These deer have plenty of grass to graze upon. But maybe the next year, there's a massive drought. A lot of the plants die out. Right? The carrying capacity is lowered now because there's just not as many resources as there were the previous year. So the carrying capacity can change over time. Right? Like I said, it's really common to have logistic growth. So in the logistic growth, you'd often see these growth charts where it starts out fast, right? Growth is fast. Then it begins to slow around the halfway mark before finally plateauing out at the carrying capacity. All right, so this is typically density dependent, right? So how many individuals are in an area at a time? Right, a lot of individuals are going to use a lot more resources a lot faster. All right, I've been talking quite a bit here, so let's take a break, wake back up here. This timer actually had an alarm that went off in my last class and woke us all up. I have muted that timer, so hopefully that's not an issue here. But I want you to tell me, by looking at this graph, which one is exponential, which one is logistic growth? And it should be easy, fast. Yep.
So, which one goes up, guys?
Give another example of a species that shows exponential growth. There we go. Oh, they probably do. They're introduced, they're not native. Yeah.
I went on a field trip once to a place in California, and they had a shit ton of there. And So to get rid of the rattlesnakes, we obviously made the very smart decision of bringing in peacocks, and now we have a peacock
What
problem.
time do you think?
And there are hundreds of them all over the place.
I'd rather have peacocks.
I haven't heard of that example.
Well, because it's a personal experience.
Yeah. Trying to use some biological control mechanism.
It didn't work. They were all over the parking lot and everything.
A lot of times it doesn't work. Yeah. All right, hopefully this was easy and you got it right away. What is this red line on my left show? Exponential growth, yes, which means the other one is logistic. And where does it plateau out at? What do we call that? The carrying capacity, yes. All right. Any questions about population ecology? Like I said, a lot of times it's very mathematical based. Once you get your data, you make some models on what you might want to predict about this population in the future. All right, so we've talked about species. What makes a species, right? How species combine together to form populations. But it's very rare to only have one species in an area. Typically, we have assemblages of species, and that would be communities. Right? So community ecology would be focused on studying the interactions of everything that's living in an area. Right? So if we think about under the sea here, right, the community here would be all the fish species, all the aquatic plant species, all the corals, the sponges, the sea cucumbers, the algae, the microorganisms. Everything in that area would be the community. Same with our African savanna here. All right, so if we have communities all living in the same area, there's bound to be interactions. All right, so different populations can interact. Right, there can be competition. So this is showing barnacles. This is a really classic study that was done on competition. Barnacles compete for space on these tidal rocks. Now we can have competition for food or mates. We can have interactions where it benefits both parties involved or all parties involved, like mutualisms. We can have parasitism, right, where one is going to benefit and one is not going to benefit. The same with like pathogens, right? Small microorganisms are kind of like sucking the life out of whatever they're invading. We can have predation, right? Here we have a snow leopard chasing a hare. We can also have herbivory, which is kind of like the plant version of predation, right? Insects and other animals eating the leaf matter. We're going to focus on competition, and then we'll talk about the others on Tuesday, right? So competition, again, we're coming back to this idea of a niche, right? The way that an organism lives and interacts with its environment, both at the biotic components and the abiotic components, right? So space, food, temperature, mating. So when we have organisms that have these very specific niches, how they use their environment, when their niches overlap and they start to use the same part of the environment, that's where we get competition. Right? So now we're going to be competing for resources. Again, the competition for resources could be food. It could be where to build your nest. It could be competition to find a mate. So we have an example up here of seed size, right? There's a range of sizes here. And we have this species that eats seeds kind of in this mid-range of seed sizes, right? It kind of likes the in-between size. If we have another species that typically likes the larger seeds, right, but will also eat some of these medium-sized seeds, we can start to see their niches for seed size, for food, is starting to overlap. right, on these bigger, medium-sized seeds. This is where competition is going to be starting to occur between these two species, right, because we have overlap in a resource that they are both using. All right, so if we're using the same resource, there's going to be some sort of competition. So we're going to look at a study, well, actually before we look at a study, we're going to talk about the types of competition here. Right? Competition can be between individuals of the same species. Right? So this would be intra-specific competition. Right? So maybe they're competing over a kill that was just made. Right? They're competing for food. Maybe they're competing for a mate. Maybe they're competing to get the best nesting site in a tree. Or it could be between different individuals, right? Maybe it's like this little ground squirrel competing for food, these nuts with the birds, right? Nuts or seeds there, right? So competition between different species. Right, in my last class, I asked them, how would you differentiate intra and inter, because they sound really similar, right? And I had a student tell me that intra, right, they are the same, and same has an A just like intra, right? Maybe that helps you. Or interspecific, right? Oh, I actually forgot her analogy. But it's like differences, right? Does anybody have a way that they would memorize interspecific? Kind of sounds like in between species, interbreed. Yeah, think about the words that have inter in it. Yeah. All right. So we can have intra or interspecific competition. We're going to look at competition that is interspecific. Now they're all paramecium, but they are different species of this single-celled organism. All right, so this scientist, Gregory here, he worked with 3 paramecium species. So he took each of these paramecium species and he grew them by themselves, right, just to see how they grew. He needed a baseline, right? Are they going to develop large populations, small populations, exponential or logistic growth? Now we found that they all showed logistic growth, right, because they're all plateauing out at some point. But he did find that there was one species that just doesn't have a big of a population, that plateaus out at a smaller density than the others. All right, so now he has his baseline. He knows how they would grow if they are not competing with another species. Right? And he knows that each of these grew logistically. So now he put 2 of these species together, right? And he grew them in the same environment. So these 2 species, what he saw is that one species, right, and I have a hard time pronouncing this species name, but P. aurelia here, showed that it kept growing, showed exponential growth, plateaued out. But this P. caudatum here, right, that species initially started to grow out fine, but then plummeted in size until it essentially died out. So what he saw was what we call competitive exclusion, right? One species is winning over the other, right? One species is out-competing the other for the resources, right? So maybe this species was better at gathering food, right? And thus out-competed, right, the other species for food. All right, so this was 2 of his species. Now remember, he looked at 3. So now he's going to put 2 other species together, and he saw something different, right? He saw that both of them actually grew logistically. And in fact, if you looked at their baseline, right, this caudatum grew and had a higher population, but on its own, it developed a higher population. This P. bursaria, right, plateaued out at a lower population size. But again, that's to be expected because by itself, it just tends to have a lower population size. So this time, instead of seeing competitive exclusion, he saw coexistence, right? So there's these 2 outcomes. Either you're going to competitively exclude your competitor, or you're going to be able to coexist with your competitor. One way that coexistence can occur is by resource partitioning. So how a species or multiple species might use a resource differently, and thus allowing all of those species to survive in the same area. Right. So this, another classic study was done here. Robert MacArthur, he looked at these different species of warblers. He noticed that they were all able to coexist and live in the same area. And when he performed his research, what he found was that these species used parts of a tree in different ways, right? Some of them tended to stay towards the top of the tree, right? So maybe they were catching the insects that flew by across the top of the tree here. Some of these warblers were kind of in the middle of the tree. So now maybe they were using the insects that were like burrowing in the bark. And another species used the tree that was closer to the ground, right? So maybe they were using the tree as like cover, and they were eating the insects on the ground below the tree, right? They were partitioning out their resources. It allowed them all to coexist. All right, so if we're thinking about competition, there's two outcomes. There's competitive exclusion, we have a winner, we have a loser, or there's coexistence, most often because of resource partitioning. Right? So big picture here, we have different species using the same resource, there is going to be competition. The outcome of that competition can vary. And competition is common, right? We see competition all the time. All right, so we have time for this group question here. So I want you to Google an example of competition, and then I want you to be able to share with the class, is your example inter or intra-specific competition, right? And does it show competitive exclusion, or does it show coexistence? I'll be interested to hear what you come up with here. And you can work with each other, work next to each other.
Loggerhead turtles and shorebirds.
Okay. That's interesting.
Survive from nesting on barrier islands.
That's interesting.
Oh, and snakes and turtles, like bog turtles,
Is it
compete for marsh swamp habitat.
so it's exclusionary?
That would be exclusionary.
Yeah, it's like the title of it.
Turtles to me are one of the scariest animals. You're scared of sea turtles? Okay, not sea turtles, snapping turtles. If I saw a snapping turtle in the lake, I'm freaking out. If I see a sea turtle in the ocean, I'm fine.
I wanted a turtle in the ocean. We live by a pond.
For me.
So I took the snapping turtle. It was okay for like 2 days before my mom realized I had a snapping turtle. I was biking over the summer and I found a snapping turtle that was about 4 feet and it was stuck. And so I was desperately trying to not get bit by the snapping turtle while it was this 4-foot snapping turtle. While I was moving it away so it could get back to the lake instead of getting its head stuck in the goddamn back. I did get it out. I was very happy. And then I continued biking and I found a 5-foot snapping turtle that was fine, but I was like, what the fuck?
Something's in the water.
There's 2 different lakes too. I was like, what in the fuck is going on? I don't know.
No, I don't like snapping turtles. Sea turtles, darling. Love sea turtles.
I got back.
They're like little rhinoceros. Physically, and everyone knows why they're not.
What's scary about this?
Oh, what's scary about that? Sea turtles. They're like scared of like sea turtles.
You said it was a show this.
A couple times.
Just like form. I like cortisol. It doesn't show highlighted what I'm thinking.
They're a really big Taurus has some.
All right, what is an example of competition that you were able to find that you would like to share? I know I'm asking a lot. We're at the end of the semester, end of the week. Yeah. Oh, alligators and crocodiles for food. Do they live in the same area geographically?
Well, they're not supposed to.
But they can, yeah. Okay. So is that intra or inter-specific? Inter, because they're different species. And is it coexistence or competitive exclusion? Yeah, there's a winner, there's a loser. One's going to get the food, one is not going to get the food. Any other examples you'd like to share? Yeah.
Species like bears, salmon runs into a river. But sometimes they can coexist because they section off areas.
Okay. So depending on where in their environment we're looking, it could be both coexistence or competitive exclusion. Yeah. All right. So, homework for Tuesday, there's really not much. Just keep studying for that final. That last content check is due tonight, which you could finish in class before you leave, both the Moodle part and the part 2. And then keep in mind that final is a week from today, so it's coming up fast, right? One more week, and then hopefully you're home free. You can go home, enjoy some time off. Our content check, I decided to do something a little bit differently. So you're going to be working in groups of 2 to 3, and you're going to be using your imagination. I want you to get creative. I want you to develop a fictitious scenario where 2 populations of one species becomes 2 separate species because of reproductive isolation. Right? So you have to come up with a name for your species. Right? I want you to describe where does it live, what reproductive isolation has occurred. Is this pre or post-zygotic? And allopatric or sympatric speciation. And I'm going to encourage you to not use AI too much to help you out here.
Are we turning in one?
Yes, one as a group. So make sure all of your names are on
You
it.
can do it on it. It's pretty dangerous though.
You ready?
Okay. Sprinkle. Biggest?
Do you want to work together? Okay. Yeah.
What happened? Because one time I spelled someone's name.
Oh, yes, it was in the middle of the lecture.
And ever since then I've been too scared.
You're technically not able to do it. Well, I added it out because the video would do it. Although I've only met this chat.
Okay. Oh, I spelled it like that. Why I do that?
Yeah.
And they got me wrong. No, they spelled it like this.
Oh, well, that's their fault.
And I was like, my friend Noelle spells it like that.